Okay, welcome back from the coffee break. Ready to start the next session. So I'm Claire Crawford. I'm from the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities. And as Grace mentioned earlier, we're kind of co-leading this grant, which is bringing together a whole bunch of projects of which you're hearing just a selection today. So I'm going to talk to you about a project which is not explicitly focused on working with firms, but it's taking that step back and thinking a bit less about what is happening within businesses and a bit more about what's happening earlier in the system that might affect individuals' chances of ending up in a good job or with high earnings. So I'm going to talk to you about one of the papers we've been working on. It's co-authored with 3 other co-authors who are also working on our grant. And it's focusing on one of the dimensions of productivity, one of the dimensions of diversity in particular that we've been thinking about across the grant, which is socioeconomic background. So I'm going to be talking about how we might kind of enrich the measures of socioeconomic background that we consider, either as policymakers or as businesses, and so on, and how we might think about using that to understand the differences in outcomes that people might go on to experience. So I'm not going to spend a long time kind of talking about existing literature. I'm going to keep it quite high level, what I tell you about today. I'm going to show you a few graphs, but very happy to take kind of questions and so on afterwards if anyone does want to dig into any more detail. So if you are familiar with the work that happens in this area, there is really a very big literature which looks at how different outcomes vary by socioeconomic background. So that is, you can think about education, how chances of taking different qualifications, achieving different amounts, as well as the likelihood of going on to get certain types of jobs might vary according to individuals' background. So in the UK, most of the studies that try to do this tend to focus on just snapshots of what your circumstances might have been when you were a child growing up. So you might capture their family income at a particular point in time, or you might see what their parents' education was or their occupation at a certain age. And what that obviously gives you a sense of is, at a particular point in time, the circumstances somebody was facing and how that is related to what happens to them later. But some recent developments in administrative data, so that's data that's collected by the government for the purposes of kind of administering different public services, which have now been kind of joined together and shared for research purposes, mean that we can now get data which allows us to have a kind of annual snapshot of somebody's circumstances throughout their childhood, particularly within the school system. So what that now allows us to do is, instead of focusing just on a snapshot at a particular point in time, to kind of build up that picture to see how many years of their schooling did someone experience, and we're going to focus on a particular measure of low family income. How many years did they experience living in a low family income? Was it throughout their entire school history, or was it just at a particular point in time? And does that matter? Do their outcomes look different if we compare someone, as we've traditionally done, who has low income or a low socioeconomic status just at a particular point in time, as compared to what we would see if we were able to look throughout their childhood? So what I'm going to show you today is going to try to do this. So we're going to look at differences in the chances of being in employment, and amongst those who are in employment, the differences in earnings between people characterised by this measure of disadvantage, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a moment. So we're particularly interested in understanding, does it vary according to whether you're temporarily in a low family income environment, or whether that persists. And then I'm going to show you some figures which are going to kind of show you the raw gaps, like if you just looked at the data on average, what would the outcomes be for people in those different situations? And then I'm going to try and account for some of the other things that we might think are important in determining whether someone's got a job or how much they earn. And particularly important for us is going to be what their educational attainment looks like. So because we know that there are already big gaps between young people from different backgrounds by the end of school, we know that there are differences in what they've attained. And we know that how well you've done in school does predict whether you're likely to go on and get a job and how much you earn. So if those from disadvantaged backgrounds have already got lower educational qualifications, we can ask the question whether that explains entirely the gap in who's getting a job and how much they earn, or actually whether there is a difference over and above what we know about how well they've done in school. So I'll show you some results which kind of point to that. So we use, as I mentioned, this administrative data, which has relatively recently been shared with researchers for the purpose of kind of shedding light on these types of questions. It's called the longitudinal education outcomes data for anyone who's interested in kind of going away and finding out more about it. But essentially what this data does is it puts together several different data sets which are collected by government departments to help them understand and administer public services or the tax system. So this combines education records, so information from schools, from further education colleges, from universities, and then it combines those with information from HMRC on your tax records and from DWP on your out-of-work benefit records. So it's pulling together all those pieces of information. It's doing that primarily, is mainly doing it for people who are based in England, so specifically people who've been either to a school or a further education college in England. But it's able to follow people. If you move to Scotland, for example, to work, we would still be able to capture that in the data. And it's focusing on people who've been in those school or college systems since 2001 too. So it's relatively younger cohorts, those born primarily since the mid-80s. And depending on the cohort we look at, for the oldest cohorts we can follow them up to kind of around age 40 now. But for the cohort that I'm going to tell you about, they did their GCSEs in the early 2010s. And the reason why we focused on that particular set of people is because what we want to do is look back through their school history in order to be able to say, throughout their time in compulsory schooling, were they eligible for free school meals, which I'll talk more about in a minute, in every one of those years. But then we also want to look forward to be able to track people into the labour market as late as possible. Because the literature that exists would suggest that you don't kind of reach the peak of the differences that you might observe between people depending on family background until people kind of get to their early to mid-40s. And so the earlier we capture people, we might be in danger of understating the extent of differences. And you can think about that being because if you stay in education for longer, you might kind of start on a relatively lower salary and then your wages might grow over time. And so for people who've joined the labour market earlier, they'll have been a bit further along that growth curve than they might otherwise have been. And so you might capture a kind of difference which is a bit understated. So we wanted to push it as late as possible, but we can still only look up to age 25. So these are probably still going to be underestimating what we might expect to see if we were able to follow people across their entire careers. But what this does allow us to do is look at these differences based on childhood circumstances in terms of what people are doing in the labour market at age 25. And then because we've got all this rich information about the schooling that people have kind of undertaken and the qualifications they've done, we can do that second part which I mentioned, which is once we take account of how well people have done and what types of qualifications they've studied, do we still see any differences remaining or have they all disappeared? So is it just driven by education or is there something else going on? So I've mentioned a few times that we're going to use a kind of measure of socioeconomic background that we're going to be able to capture annually. So specifically what we're doing is we're using an indicator for whether the child is eligible for free school meals. So you can think of that as a kind of marker for being from a relatively lower family income background. And we do that, we've kind of restricted our sample to people for whom we observe that information all the way from year 1 when you're age 5 through to year 11 when you're age 16. So everybody in our data we observe over that period. So about a third of people in our data have ever been eligible for free school meals when you look across that period, compared to maybe like a kind of 1 year snapshot of 20%, something like that. So you can see already that by looking across the whole span, you are picking up additional people compared to what you might do if you just looked at one point in time. And about 5% of the whole cohort were eligible in every one of those 11 years. So 5% of people were eligible for free school meals throughout their school careers, compared to about 30% who were eligible at some point, but not for the whole period. So we've got quite a lot of variation that we can work with, which is nice for us. So we're summing up the number of years that you're eligible for free school meals. If you've never been eligible for free school meals, which is obviously the case for kind of 2/3, 70% of our sample, we don't have any information about your individual kind of family income or socioeconomic background, but what we do know is information about the neighbourhood in which you lived. So this is quite a common thing to do in schools or universities, some businesses as well, who might use information about where you live as a kind of rough proxy for what your own background might look like. So we're looking at very local neighbourhoods. So it's capturing a kind of small area which would cover around maybe 1,500 households. So you're looking at quite a small geographic area, and you're taking average information about the people in that area and saying that I think that's a kind of reasonable proxy for what you as an individual living in that area might have in terms of your socioeconomic background. So the measure we're using is essentially like an area level version of this free school meal indicator. It's saying what proportion of families in your neighbourhood had a child who would be eligible for free school meals. And so we're kind of saying if you lived in a neighbourhood where very few families were eligible for free school meals, we think you might be relatively more advantaged than if you live in an area with very many families eligible for free school meals. So it's not perfect, but it's the best we've got in the data if we want to include information about those who were never eligible for free school meals. So we split people into kind of groups based on this information. So either you're in a kind of a group with other people who've been eligible for free school meals for the same number of years as you have, or you're in a kind of decile group. So we split the never eligible group into 10 equally sized groups. And so you're in a group depending on whether you're the most advantaged 10% and so on down to the least advantaged 10% amongst those who've never been eligible for free school meals. There's a bit of a mouthful, so if anyone's got any clarification questions, please do interrupt as we go along. I'm very happy to answer them. Hopefully the graphs will make it a little bit clearer though. Okay, so apologies for the small text, which people at the back of the room might be struggling to see. But I'm going to show you a few graphs which are looking like this. So when you see something similar, you'll know that the kind of axes and everything are labelled similarly. So what this is doing is it's basically looking at how likely people are to be in work relative to a group in the middle. So what we've done is said, okay, let's look at how likely someone is to be employed if they were eligible for free school meals for 11 years. That's the very top set of bars. And how does that compare to someone who was never eligible for free school meals but living in a really poor neighbourhood? So that's the group we've kind of left out, and then everything else is relative to that middle group. So the poorer individuals are at the top, and then it works its way all the way down to the bottom group who are living in the most advantaged neighbourhoods who've never been eligible for free school meals. The axes, the kind of line around which they're kind of situated is 0, and then you've got this far one is 10% and the far left one is minus 20%. So the way to think about this is if you were eligible for free school meals throughout your school career for that full 11 years, you're about 12 percentage points less likely to be working at age 25 than someone who was never eligible but lived in a poor neighbourhood. And if you lived in the most advantaged neighbourhoods, if you're a woman, which is in orange, you're about 5 percentage points more likely to be employed. If you're a man, maybe 3 percentage points more likely to be employed. So there are big differences. And normally what you do is kind of group all those ones who have got negative effects together into one basket. Or you might just look at a particular age, and so some of those individuals would have dropped out and wouldn't appear in your sample at all. So I think it's quite interesting to see the kind of magnitude of the differences. That's all I'm going to show you on employment. And what I'm going to focus on is, amongst those who are employed, how much does the earnings that people in those groups have differ, again according to our same set of groups. So this is already amongst a select group of people. You've already seen that the people in work are relatively more socioeconomically advantaged than those who are not. But even here we see big differences, bigger in kind of percentage terms than for the employment figures. So again, at the top is the poorest, at the bottom is the relatively more advantaged. And so, if again, here we've got women in red, men in blue. If you look at the top, someone who was eligible for free school meals throughout their school career is earning about 25 to 30% less than someone in work who was in the most disadvantaged neighbourhood but had never been eligible for free school meals. And similarly, if you compare people who are in the kind of more advantaged neighbourhoods, you're seeing a 25 to 30% positive effect on earnings compared to someone who is living in a more disadvantaged neighbourhood. So really big differences, much bigger than I was expecting when I came to this, and I'm someone who knew what the very big gaps looked like without being able to disaggregate it further like this. So that's the kind of raw differences. Now I want to tell you a little bit about how much of that can be explained by other things that we know differ between people from different backgrounds. So because of this really rich data that we've got, essentially we can kind of follow people over time and see at every point, as long as they're not missing from our data, which is a very small proportion of people, we can see whether they were in education, what type of education they were in, what level of education they were in, were they working as well as being in education, or were they just in education, were they employed, were they on out of work benefits, were they kind of missing from our data. So we can kind of segment people into these different groups at different points in time. So we do that between 17 and 23. And now I'm going to show you a very busy set of graphs, which I won't try and talk you through everything, but I will try and give you a flavour of what they're trying to show. So I've just extracted 4 groups from that kind of long list that I showed you previously. So on the top we have the most disadvantaged on the left, the most advantaged amongst those who were ever eligible for free school meals on the right, and similarly those just not eligible for free school meals but living in really poor neighbourhoods. That was our comparison group earlier, and then the most advantaged on the right. And then this very busy set of colours is basically showing you for each of those groups at each point in time from age 17 up to age 23, what were they doing? What was the average in that group in terms of the activities that they were doing? How did that break down across all these different categories? So if we start with this most advantaged one first, what they're mainly doing is they're doing A-levels, that's the blue and the kind of maroon colours there. Then they're going to university, which is the kind of cornflower blue and cream colours there, and then they're going to work. So they're basically following what you might think of as the traditional academic track. A-levels, university, work. The difference between these two colours is just, were they also working at the same time as studying? And actually it's more evenly split than I might have imagined. I don't know what you would have thought, but so it's roughly kind of equally split, but that's their tradition. They're following what you might think of as the traditional path. If you move to the left, you can already see that there's a bit more variation. So there's a few more people who are doing vocational qualifications. The kind of green and orange is vocational. You can see that there are fewer people following the path into university, but relatively more of them are kind of moving into work. And so it doesn't look at the end of this graph as if the kind of proportions work in a massively different between those two groups, although there is a bit of a difference in terms of this out of work benefits group. This one doesn't look a million miles away from that one, as you might not expect, given that they're kind of next to each other in our groupings. A little bit of difference, not massive. But then if you move across to this top left-hand one, you can see that there's a lot more heterogeneity in terms of what people are doing. Many more people doing level 2 qualifications, so that's kind of the equivalent of GCSEs, and not necessarily progressing to level 3 qualifications. Many fewer going to university, and actually many fewer working, and many more on out-of-work benefits. So that's the kind of pink group. So really a very large chunk of that group who've been relatively disadvantaged throughout their school careers in families who might themselves have been claiming out-of-work benefits. Many of those are going on to do the same by the time they're age 25. So that's already pointed towards the fact that we might expect there to be this kind of educational attainment to be making quite a big difference to these raw gaps. So the next two figures I'm going to show you are just for men on this graph and then for women on the next graph. How do the raw gaps that I showed you earlier change if we account for all those other factors? So we compare people who are from the same ethnic backgrounds, who've gone through the same kind of educational qualifications, had similar prior, earlier labour market experiences, and so all that should remain amongst the things that we can account for in our data is the socioeconomic background between these groups. So the dark blue bars are the same ones as I showed you earlier. The light blue bars are what is left after we've accounted for these other things that are different between the groups. So after we've compared someone who's got the same educational attainment, the same qualifications, and so on. So you can see that the figures are, the kind of bars are much smaller, but they're not zero. So for these more advantaged people, the men are still earning maybe 8% more than someone kind of in the middle of the distribution. If you look at the bottom, the gap is slightly bigger, maybe around 10%. So these are very similar people with very similar educational histories, but they're still earning quite different amounts once they're in work, because for reasons that are associated with their socioeconomic background that we can't pick up. So obviously that could be a whole myriad of things, and the data that we've got doesn't allow us to really well unpick what those are. But other evidence has kind of pointed towards the kinds of things that might be. And I'll just show you the similar figure for women. So I think interestingly for women, we seem to be able to explain more of the variation amongst those who are relatively less well off, but actually less of the variation that we were able to explain for men amongst those who are relatively more advantaged. So, and I think some of this might be to do with the role of vocational qualifications and how that differs between men and women. So actually, if you look at men who've kind of gone on the traditional academic A-level university track and compared their earnings to someone who's gone on a vocational track, at age 25, their earnings are often not very different, and actually someone on the vocational track may even be earning more. And that's because the types of things that men study, if they go on vocational routes, are things that pay well: engineering, construction, things like that. If women go on a vocational route, they're studying things that typically don't pay very well: health, healthcare, childcare, hairdressing, things like that. The vocational choices are really very strongly gendered, and that might help to explain that pattern. So just to kind of summarise, we've seen really big differences in earnings and employment probabilities, but I focused on earnings here, by the level of childhood disadvantage. So not just were you ever eligible, but how many years were you eligible is making a really kind of important difference in understanding what people are going on to do later. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I think these are probably underestimates, both because we're looking at people young and because for more advantaged families, we're only able to look at the neighbourhood where people live and not their own personal characteristics. And that tends to mean that we understate differences. Some of this can be explained by what happens earlier, not to say that that is a kind of justifiable reason why people from different socioeconomic backgrounds might earn more. We definitely want to be kind of overcoming differences in the education system as well, but if we just zero in on what's left over, we still see that there are gaps, which points towards the fact that perhaps recruitment practices or promotion practices, which we're going to hear a little bit more about from Paul later, might be affecting people differentially from different backgrounds. So in terms of what we might think of this, what might we take of this from a kind of business perspective or a policy perspective? So I guess it re-emphasises this idea of the leaky pipeline, which you might have heard about before, where people from kind of underrepresented backgrounds typically fall away at each step as you move further towards whatever your goal might be, whether it's a good high-paying job or whatever you're interested in. We typically have kind of underrepresentation at each point along the way, and that accumulates up to these really big differences that we see at the end. So for universities and firms who might be thinking about how can they change recruitment practices, or how might they consider people's background, which many do, I guess this would suggest that even though it's often kind of the only thing that's feasible to collect, that binary measure of someone's socioeconomic background is still going to be hiding a lot of variation. So I think there's a question, I guess, over whether it's feasible to collect anything more, but this certainly kind of suggests that there's still a lot of variation that is not coming through. And then in terms of kind of how we might think about policy or practice changing, you could certainly think about things that are mattering in the school system. So we have a pupil premium, which means that schools get some additional money to help support the learning of pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. That's constant, it's the same for people who have been eligible for 5 years, 10 years, just appeared in the data that year. Maybe we want to think about weighting that a bit more towards students that we know have been facing persistent disadvantage. Perhaps that could help. And similarly, if we're a university or a business thinking about how we target outreach activities, we again might want to be thinking about whether there's a way in which we could try to accommodate people or recruit more people who are coming from these really persistently disadvantaged backgrounds, as well as those who might have been temporarily poor. And that's everything from me. So very happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I work for a law firm and lead on our social mobility initiative, so I could ask questions all day, but I'll try and limit myself. But from looking, I work with lots of businesses who focus on social mobility and outreach initiatives, and often they're targeting kind of the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And often specific, I sort of curl my toes and they say, oh, we're just going to target those whose parents haven't attended university, which actually would probably encompass like most of those groups. I guess going to the data point, do you have any kind of recommended measure that businesses could use to kind of, because I can appreciate that most young people wouldn't have any idea what years they were in free school meals eligibility or not.
I think that's a good question. I was trying to think about it on the train on the way here. Do I have a good answer for you? I'm not sure that I do. I guess, so you've mentioned, have your parents gone to university, which again is one of the kind of, I guess, relatively more crude measures and will hide variation. I know some firms ask about, do you know what your parents did when you were 14, something like that. I wonder whether there's scope for maybe at least having do you know what they did when you were 5 or, 10 or something? So at least you get a little bit more of is there at least more than one time point that we could consider? Or even just kind of thinking about a basket of things. So if you've got several things, none of which you think are perfect, but which kind of might point towards disadvantage, I guess going back to that point about intersectionality, if you know that someone is disadvantaged on like all of the, let's say, 5 measures that you've identified, then you might say that is kind of relatively likely to be more disadvantaged than someone who's only ticking the box on one. And I guess the other thing I'd say is that these neighbourhood measures, so people might know their address when they were 14 or something, or even at different ages. Those neighbourhood measures, they're not perfect, but they will give you a pretty good idea of like what were the circumstances in which people were, what was the kind of community or local neighbourhood like. It's often less good for places like London, where you can have very different kind of geographical, or very different types of neighbourhoods located very geographically close. But I think it can provide an extra thing that could be useful if businesses are not already collecting that, just because it is easy to remember your address, and people might have more chance of being able to do that. Any other questions? Yeah.
So for the people who were in free school meals for just like 1 or 2, maybe up to 5 years, is there any way to look into if they have siblings that maybe weren't eligible for free school meals? Like if that free school meals came in where one sibling went through the whole education period without it, and then for whatever reason a younger sibling was eligible the other way around.
Yeah.
So anyway, to see how that would.
So like within family differences,
Yeah.
kind of thing. The administrative data is not currently great for that. So there are kind of, I think it's 3 cohorts in the data where they did some testing, where they look to see, can we try and figure out who are siblings amongst people in these 3 cohorts. So maybe for a subset it would be possible. But hopefully, so this data is still being developed, because obviously the government now has this opportunities mission and they want to try and affect intergenerational income mobility, which means you have to be able to link the incomes of parents and children. So we can't currently do that except through the way that I'm describing here, where we have this proxy for free school meals. So they're currently working on how to improve the data, and I think the kind of route that they're going down probably will allow us to look more carefully at within family differences in future. So it's definitely something to think about in the coming months and years.
I just have a comment based on the question that you asked. So I know in LSE and in some other universities, philanthropists who fund scholarships are really frustrated along the lines that you say. So they basically say, look, we look at the kids who are getting the scholarships and actually they could have afforded to go by themselves. They would have figured it out by themselves. We have a new scholarship program which is called the UGLA Scholarship Program, and one of his conditions of funding is that there's a number of lower socioeconomic measures, and that he will pull the funding if we don't bring in kids who actually who satisfy that. So I think the first thing for companies is to look for scholarships where you know the search is more than just kind of one measure. I think the second is, I know of a law firm that goes to schools that are in very, very deprived areas and offers apprenticeships in those very, very deprived areas. So again, it mightn't be a perfect measure because, as Claire has shown, there's variation, but again, it's kind of going out of the usual search ways, and those are the 2 things that I've shown to be effective. But I think if you as a law company were to say to a university, actually we really want people who are socially mobile across a variety of dimensions, we don't just want to be getting from the middle, then universities have the incentives to do a broader search. So I think that pushback is quite helpful.
Yeah. I think there was another question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on that one. So it would be good to see as well, like once the data does become more, like you get a bit more information on it, about how people who change throughout that period, between that period, because like speaking from personal experience, I've like, from at the start of my school life, free school meals, and then out of it, and I also had friends who went the opposite way due to separation or losing jobs like that. It'd be interesting to see how that correlates in terms of your change in circumstances, whether if you start to benefit later on in the schooling life, or start to deteriorate later on in school life, how that correlates. So it'd be good to see anything that comes out around that as well.
Yeah, no, we were also really interested in that. So we didn't do exactly what you said in terms of trajectories, but we did try to look and see, okay, if you look at people who've had the same number of years eligible, but some had it mostly in secondary school and some had it mostly in primary school, can you see any kind of discernible difference? The answer was not really, which I was kind of surprised about. So I think it's probably how many people in the data we have to kind of do that, because even though we've got the whole cohort, once you're kind of zeroing in and so on and so forth, you're getting down to small sample sizes. So I think it probably is a power problem, but yeah, I think definitely something to look at more in future as well.
Do kids segregate in school, Claire? Because I didn't work in the British System. Do kids segregate depending on free school status? Does it have a networking effect?
There's a lot of variation. So yes, there are definitely schools which have very high proportion of kids eligible and some which have very low, but often many are kind of in the middle along the national average. So we haven't looked at it. We haven't looked at it here specifically, but definitely other work like the work that was put out recently, looking at kind of social capital, shows that having more diverse peers as a low-income individual helps you to be more socially mobile. So I would hypothesise that we'd see the same here.
Yep.
Am I getting the nod for holding on questions?
Oh, sorry.
So do you mind if I go to this lady who didn't ask a question, and then we can talk in the break, if that's all right? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is there much research done on whether people are using their degree? Because something that I've noticed is I grew up in a low social mobility area, and more people went to university, but also a huge number of them just went home and have just done jobs that they could have done without a degree.
Yeah.
And only a handful of us have managed to stay out and get like a grad scheme and kind of start to progress in that way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's easier to get those jobs because you can go in and find that.
Yeah.
So is there research done kind of around that?
Yeah, so it's not something we can look at in our data because we don't see we can't see everything that we would need in order to be able to do that. But yes, there is other research that's looked at, have you got a graduate job, quote unquote, like are you making use of it? And yes, there's more over-education amongst those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and mobility is probably a big part of the story. So we see a lot more mobility amongst the graduate population than amongst those who go to further education. And so that, because those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are overrepresented in the FE thing, they're much more tied to their local economies generally, but even amongst graduates, like you suggested, there is still some variation by socioeconomic background. So yeah, what you said is definitely borne out by the research. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for, but very happy to chat during lunch if you've got more questions.